All right, we're going to chat with Dominick Crea in just a minute. Speaking of podcasts, he's doing something right that I have not yet figured out. He's got something like 20,000 people tuning into every edition of his podcast. Why? Because the content is good. You'll hear next, because Dominick Crea is a fascinating guy with an interesting perspective on the criminal justice system. You're listening to The Other Side of Midnight. I'm Frank Morano. We'll continue with Dominick Crea of the Justice Tech Pros podcast right after this.
This is The Other Side of Midnight with Frank Morano, 77 WABC.
3:35, this is The Other Side of Midnight. I'm Frank Morano. This is a show that has probably spent, even though we're only 3 weeks and 1 day old, more time looking at the criminal justice system than any other radio show in New York. Certainly any other radio show within the last 3 weeks. And a few months ago, I became a rabid fan of the Justice Tech Pros podcast. This is a podcast which takes you on an inside look at what's happening in the criminal justice system. It gives you actually incredibly helpful information that if you're ever charged with a crime or a loved one is ever charged with a crime, that's exactly the kind of thing that you need to know. And even though they're relatively new as a podcast, they've already got something like 7,700 subscribers on YouTube. I go to the YouTube page, and you can check this out for yourself. Just type in Justice Tech Pros, and you go, oh, how many people watched the latest episode? Oh, 20,000. 20,000. You know what I wouldn't give for 20,000 people listening to the podcast of this show? So I said, all right, well, clearly these guys have figured out how to get people to listen. I've got to get these guys on with me. So on my Long Island show, I've interviewed Dominick Crea from the Justice Tech Pros podcast several times, but this is his debut on The Other Side of Midnight. Dominick, thanks for staying up late for me.
No, not a problem. Thanks again for having me on.
No, it's my pleasure. So, Dominick, since this is your first time on this show, speaking to the overnight audience, explain to people what the Justice Tech Pros podcast is.
Basically, it's a podcast where I just try to talk to the public on a common sense level, just about my experience. I have a litigation support firm where we handle tasks and preparation for trial, for counsel. So this kind of was spawned from that, and I just try to break things down where the defendant could relate, where the general public could relate, just so they could see how things really take place from a human perspective. You know, just understand what the process is, my philosophies on different things, how it affects families, how it affects the defendant, how it affects the defense team. And I try to give them tips and things to be aware of, to look for, so they could prepare the best they can if they are ever faced, unfortunately, with the system, or their loved ones ever faced with the system.
Now, part of the reason this podcast was created was because of your experience with your father. Tell folks about your father's situation.
Yes, absolutely. That's actually what really forced me to put it together. My father had a trial, and he was wrongfully convicted. Going through the different stages of the trial as things were playing out, I was witnessing firsthand how a defendant really doesn't have much control on what is said and what isn't said in the courtroom. I mean, if the judge controls a trial a certain way, they really decide in which direction it goes based on motions that are approved, based on objections that are approved or denied. And when you see that taking place, when you're in the behind the scenes and you're going through discovery and you're seeing evidence that is there or is not there, and then when it doesn't get to make its debut in the courtroom, you're realizing how much the juries are missing, and they're not really getting the full picture. And unfortunately, due to that and many other unfortunate series of events, he was wrongfully convicted. And now, we're in the appeal phase. And that kind of gave me the motivation now to really get the word out there and appeal to members of the public so they could just kind of understand if they ever are on the jury. That was really the main focus at the beginning, to appeal to potential and current jurors. So if they ever are on a jury panel, maybe they'll start to think about things they may not be seeing, or to ask more questions, or to try to understand how things are playing out in the courtroom. When objections are made, why are they being made? If the judge isn't allowing certain evidence in, why is that? Just to get a good picture of it. Regardless of how they feel on the topic, they're entitled to know as much as they can so they can make a more
Sure.
educated decision.
But you, just to be clear, and we're talking with Dominick Crea, you could check out the Justice Tech Pros podcast on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. Just search Justice Tech Pros on YouTube. It's the easiest way to get it for me. But you had this litigation support firm even before your father went through this ordeal, right?
That is correct. I was actually helping clients. What I specialized in at the beginning more so was I'm pretty tech savvy, so we would get hard drives. A lot of the discovery, which is the evidence against the defendant, comes in on a hard drive type basis. So what we would do is we would field that information, we would get it, we would work on extracting it for the lawyers, going through it, trying to find things that could help the case, help build the defense team, try to match up any inaccuracies based on statements made during pretrial, to prove any falsities that may have been made, or false and misleading statements.
All right. So now, one of the questions that I think everybody asks at some point in their life, whether they're involved in the criminal justice system or buying a house or getting married or getting divorced or putting together their will, is they need to find the right attorney. How in the world, with so many attorneys out there, how do you actually find a proper attorney, especially if you ever find yourself as a defendant in a criminal case?
Well, that's a challenge in of itself, because as you point out, if you go on the internet, which nowadays that's really the go-to for people to go on the internet, they'll do a search, and a lot of attorneys will come up, on the first page of results, but that really just means that there could be a positive SEO rankings and SEO ratings. So you don't really get a good picture. You're just seeing all of the plus side. You're seeing the good marketing, you're seeing the fancy website. And it's hard to really tell what the attorney's about, and if they're going to do what they promise and if they're going to follow through. So, that's one of the things that one of the obstacles I've seen, and also I've experienced it personally when helping build my father's team. You will meet with certain attorneys, and you may get promised the world. And then when the time comes to start diving in and really going through the information and really dissecting the information, some are on autopilot, and they're not following through on what was represented. So what I started thinking about, what I would have done differently in certain situations, is a little bit more due diligence. So what I mean by that is you want to try to do searches based on actual cases. You could go to Pacer, you could go to different sources, putting in the attorney's name, see what cases they were on, try to reach out to prior defendants just to get a feel of their work ethic, their abilities, their record, how long they've been practicing, have they had a big gap in between cases. There's a lot you need to kind of find out, so you could at least do as much as you can prior to making that commitment and prior to retaining the individual.
So what am I looking for when I search Pacer and other sources? You can't simply just look at a win-loss record, because sometimes some of the best attorneys end up representing some of the most guilty people. What am I looking for when I look at an attorney's body of work and his resume and his career?
Absolutely. You can't go by the record. I agree with that. What I personally look for, I want somebody who's going to be fighting for me. I want to see some of the trial minutes. I want to see how examinations went. I want to see the questions that were asked. I want to see, if they really had a passion and they really had a fire, or did they sit idle as trial went by and they didn't really, work to defend that client. And I also want to see the ability to follow through on promises. I would speak to past clients and ask them right out, after the retainer, after, payment was made, was everything you promised followed through on? In other words, you may have not have gotten the result you wanted, but did the attorney at least follow through, working hard for your case, standing by your side, and doing the best of their ability to defend your case? Because that's all you really want. You want somebody who's just going to fight for you, regardless of unfortunately, if you don't have a good outcome, if they did fight for you and they exhausted all their efforts and you know they were working on the case nonstop, you can't really ask for more than that.
Right. Well, that's good advice. We're talking with Dominick Crea. You can hear him regularly on the Justice Tech Pros podcast. These are the sorts of issues that he takes you through on that podcast. You know, speaking of podcasts, Dominick, there was an article recently, and I think I heard you mention it in a recent edition of your podcast. There was an article recently that showed that there are over 950,000 podcasts out there. I mean, that is wild that there are that many podcasts out there. Tell me what you think of podcasting as a means of entertainment and information. Is this something that if somebody has something that they want to get off their chest or something that they're passionate about, is podcasting something that you'd encourage them to do? Or are there so many lousy podcasts out there that if someone's just starting a podcast for the first time, they'd kind of get lost in the shuffle?
Well, it can be hard and difficult to differentiate yourself from the rest, and try to set a different tone than what's existing. But I do believe it is a positive platform for anyone just to connect with listeners, connect with somebody, with individuals who may have the same interests, the same hobbies, the same businesses, whatever you find interesting, because it allows something nowadays where you can appeal to the public and you could appeal to an audience. It's difficult as far as, marketing. You have to spend a little money if you want to market it, if you want to get it out there. But in my opinion, I enjoy the whole realm of it. I like to go on. I like to search different topics that appeal to me, and I like to listen to what different people have to say. I mean, if you enjoy, hobbies or different for me, for instance, hobby-wise, I like learning about dogs. That's one of the things I like to learn about. And there's a ton of really informative podcasts that just go into detail about dogs and origins and different breeds, and I enjoy that. So I find the whole concept fascinating, and I find it very valuable in that sense.
So it's something you would encourage people to do if they're looking to if they have something they want to get off their chest or something they want to communicate to people.
Yes, as far as a leisurely thing, absolutely. And just something to, even if you want to vent and you want to connect with a certain audience and you want to promote it on social media, absolutely. But I do see some people relying on it for revenue streams and maybe for a possible, opportunity business-wise. That's a little difficult. It's
right. Well, that's what I was going to ask. So if they shouldn't look at this as some sort of this get rich quick strategy, right?
Yes, I don't believe that's really a realm where you could tap into where the money's going to come rolling in. I just don't see it. As you laid out earlier, there's 950,000 podcasts, and how many people can you really name that are making big bucks on a podcast?
Well, exactly, a handful.
Yeah.
Hey, Dominick, I've enjoyed the conversation as always. Let's do it again soon, okay?
Yep, sounds great. Thanks again for having me on.
Thank you. It's Dominick Crea. You can check him out at the Justice Tech Pros podcast. Now,